I need to tell you about a plant that breaks every rule they taught you in school. You were told plants need sunlight. Full sun, they said, 8 hours minimum. This one grows best in the shade, deep shade, the kind of darkness under a oak canopy where your tomatoes would give up and die, and it doesn't just survive there, it thrives. It produces more protein per square foot than almost anything you can grow in full sun, and it does it without asking for fertilizer, without needing pesticides, without demanding a single thing from you except to leave it alone. My grandpa grew it behind the barn where the sun never reached. He called it food insurance. His father grew it before him, their fathers before them. For generations, families around these hills kept patches of it in the shadows, and nobody thought twice about it. It was just there, quiet, dependable, waiting for the seasons when nothing else would grow. Then somewhere between my grandpa's time and mine, it got a new name: invasive, aggressive, threat. The agriculture department started putting it on lists. The extension offices told farmers to pull it out. The seed catalogs stopped carrying it. And within a single generation, something that had fed families for centuries became something you were supposed to kill on sight. I remember asking my grandpa why nobody grew it anymore. He looked at me with that tired smile he got when the world stopped making sense to him. He said, "Son, they didn't stop us because it didn't work. They stopped us 'cause it worked too well, and it worked without them." That's what this story is about. Not a plant that failed, a plant that succeeded so completely, so independently, that it became a problem for people who need you to depend on them. A plant that required no machinery, no chemicals, no annual seed purchases, no expertise except what your grandmother could teach you on a Saturday morning. A plant that grew in the one place industrial agriculture can't touch: the shadows. You won't find this in your history books. You won't find it in the USDA guides they hand out at the extension office. But you'll find it in the memories of people my age and older, in the stories we heard sitting on porches, in the quiet knowledge that got passed down when nobody official was listening. You'll find it in the woods behind old homesteads, still growing, still waiting, still producing protein in the darkness where nothing else will. They called it invasive because it spread without permission, because it didn't stay in neat rows, because it didn't need you to buy it new every spring, because it remembered how to feed people before there were corporations to tell it how. This is the story of a protein source that grows in shade. The story of why that made it dangerous. The story of how calling something invasive became the easiest way to erase it from memory. And the story of why it's coming back now, whether they like it or not. My grandpa's patch is still there behind that barn, smaller now, quieter, but every spring it comes back, thick and green and full of protein, growing in the shadows where the industrial world can't follow. And every spring I remember what he told me. Some things refuse to be forgotten, some things just wait. Let me tell you what they didn't want you to remember. My grandpa called it lamb's quarters. His grandpa called it by another name, goosefoot, because of how the leaves spread out like a webbed track in the mud. But before that, before English names, before European names, the Cherokee people who lived in these mountains called it something closer to the green that never asks. I heard that from an elder at a heritage festival years back, and it stuck with me because it's the truest name I ever heard for a plant. It never asked for anything, didn't ask for tilled soil, didn't ask for compost or manure, didn't ask for water beyond what the sky gave it, and it sure didn't ask for sunlight. While every other green thing was fighting for a spot in the sun, lamb's quarters was back in the shadows, quiet and patient, putting out leaves so thick with protein that my great-grandma used to say it was better than meat when meat was scarce. She grew up in the Depression. Her family had a garden like everyone else, but the garden was for vegetables that needed sun. The lamb's quarters grew itself in the shade along the north side of the house, under the porch, behind the woodshed. Anywhere the sun couldn't reach, it was there. She told my grandpa that during the winters, when the root cellar was running low and the chickens weren't laying, they'd go out and pick lamb's quarters. Even in the cold, it hung on longer than anything else. The leaves would get tougher, darker, but they were still there, still edible, still full of protein when protein was the difference between making it through and not making it through. My grandpa used to harvest it in 5-gallon buckets. He'd take them to the kitchen and my grandma would cook them down like spinach, except they didn't shrink as much and they didn't have that bitter tang. She'd mix them with eggs when we had eggs, or just eat them straight with a little bacon grease and salt. I grew up eating lamb's quarters and didn't know it was supposed to be a weed until I was almost grown. The old folks around here, the ones who remember the way things were before the supermarkets and the frozen foods, they all have stories like this. They all remember a parent or grandparent who kept a patch of lamb's quarters going, not in the garden, never in the garden, always in the margins, in the places where nothing else would grow. That's where it lived. That's where it waited. It wasn't decoration. It wasn't a hobby. It was food security that didn't require security. It was protein that didn't require planning. You didn't plant it on purpose most of the time. It just showed up. And when it did, you didn't pull it out. You let it grow. You knew that come winter, come hard times, come whatever the world threw at you, that patch of dark green leaves would be there in the shadows, waiting to feed you. The Cherokee knew this long before my people did. They had a whole system built around plants like lamb's quarters, plants that grew in the margins, that didn't compete with the corn and beans and squash, that filled in the gaps and fed people when the main crops failed. They understood something we forgot. They understood that the plants growing in the shadows weren't weeds. They were insurance. My grandpa's people learned that eventually, learned it from necessity, learned it from neighbors, learned it from watching what grew and what didn't. And for generations that knowledge held. Lamb's quarters in the shade, protein without asking, food that didn't need permission. Then somebody decided it needed a different name. In 1978, a researcher at the University of Connecticut named Dr. Samuel Barton published a study that my grandpa would have called Proving What We Already Knew. Dr. Barton measured lamb's quarters against spinach, lettuce, and kale. He grew them side by side in controlled conditions. Then he grew them in shade, 70% shade, the kind of darkness where your grocery store greens would pale and stretch and give up. The lamb's quarters didn't just survive, it outperformed everything. In deep shade, it produced more edible biomass per square foot than spinach in full sun. The protein content measured between 4 and 5 grams per 100 grams of leaves. That's higher than spinach, higher than kale, nearly double what you get from lettuce. And it did this in the shadows in soil that hadn't been amended without a single application of fertilizer. Dr. Barton documented something else that caught my attention when I found his paper years later in a university library, the oxalic acid content. The compound that makes spinach taste bitter and binds up nutrients in your gut was significantly lower in lamb's quarters. It was more nutritious and more digestible than the green they were selling in every grocery store in America. His conclusion was careful, academic, measured. He wrote that lamb's quarters represented a significantly underutilized food resource with particular application for low-light growing environments and low-input agricultural systems. That paper should have changed everything. It was peer-reviewed. It was published in a legitimate journal. It had numbers, data, controlled conditions, everything the scientific establishment claims to respect. I went looking for follow-up studies. I wanted to see what happened next, how this information got applied, which seed companies started marketing shade-tolerant protein greens to farmers and home gardeners. I found almost nothing. A handful of small studies in the 1980s, mostly from universities in developing countries, a few papers from researchers studying traditional food systems. But in mainstream American agriculture, silence. The research stopped. The funding dried up. Dr. Barton himself moved on to other projects. I tracked him down once, sent him a letter asking why nobody had pursued his work. He never wrote back. My grandpa didn't need Dr. Barton's study. He'd been running his own experiment for 60 years behind that barn. But I needed it. I needed to see that someone with credentials and institutional backing had measured what my family already knew. I needed proof that I wasn't romanticizing the past, that lamb's quarters really was as good as the old folks said it was. The proof was there, published, documented, measured down to the gram, and it didn't matter, because proving that a plant is nutritious and productive isn't enough. Proving that it grows in conditions where nothing else will grow isn't enough. You also have to prove that someone can make money from it, not the person growing it, the person selling it to them. Lamb's quarters had a fatal flaw in the eyes of the agricultural industry. It reseeded itself. You didn't need to buy new seeds every year. It tolerated shade, which meant it didn't need the cleared land that tractors and machinery require. It didn't need fertilizer, which meant no chemical sales. It didn't need pesticides because almost nothing bothered it. And it grew so easily that calling it a crop felt dishonest. It was just there, persistent, independent. Dr. Barton's study proved that lamb's quarters was everything the food system claimed to want: nutritious, productive, resilient, low input. What he couldn't prove, what no scientist could prove, was how to make it profitable for anyone except the person eating it. So the study sat in a journal that fewer people read every year, and the plant kept growing in the shadows. I've got a seed catalog from 1942 that belonged to my great-grandma. The pages are yellow and brittle, but you can still read 'em. Burpees, out of Philadelphia. On page 17, right there between the chard and the mustard greens, there's a listing for lamb's quarters. Chenopodium album, it says in italics. Excellent pot herb for shade gardens, vigorous and cold hardy. Packet of 500 seeds, 15 cents. 15 cents for 500 seeds of a plant that would reseed itself forever if you let it. That was the last time I could find it in a major American seed catalog. By 1950, it was gone from Burpees, gone from Park Seed, gone from Fairy Morse. I spent weeks going through old catalogs at the Agricultural Library, tracking the disappearance. It didn't happen all at once. It faded. The listings got smaller, moved to the back pages, then vanished completely. By 1960, you couldn't buy lamb's quarter seeds from a legitimate seed company in the United States even if you wanted to. What replaced it tells you everything you need to know. Hybrid spinach varieties that needed full sun. Patented lettuce cultivars that required specific fertilizer regimens. Greens that were bred for one thing: dependence. They didn't reseed true. They needed optimal conditions. They required inputs that you had to purchase every single season. The catalogs got thicker, glossier, full of vegetables that needed you to need the company behind them. My grandpa watched this happen in real time. He'd order from those catalogs every spring, sitting at the kitchen table with a pencil, marking the varieties he wanted. He saw the old reliable plants disappear and new hybrids take their place. He saw the prices go up. He saw the descriptions get longer, more complicated, full of instructions about spacing and fertilizing and disease management. And he saw that none of those new varieties would grow in shade. The seed companies didn't announce what they were doing. There was no press release that said, "We're discontinuing lamb's quarters 'cause it makes you too independent." They just quietly stopped carrying it. And when farmers wrote in asking where it went, they got polite letters back explaining that they were focusing on improved varieties with better commercial potential. Better commercial potential meant better for the company. It meant plants that locked you into a cycle of purchasing. It meant the end of vegetables that grew themselves, that saved themselves, that fed families without corporate intervention. The catalogs became tools of dependence dressed up as progress. I asked my grandpa once why he didn't just save his own lamb's quarter seeds. He laughed. He said, "Son, I don't have to. That plant saves its own seeds whether I want it to or not. That's the whole problem from their perspective." He was right. Lamb's quarters produced thousands of seeds per plant, tiny black seeds that would sit in the soil for years, waiting for the right conditions. You couldn't stop it from reseeding even if you tried, which meant you couldn't control it, couldn't patent it, couldn't force people to come back and buy it again next year. It was the opposite of everything the seed industry was building toward, so it disappeared from the catalogs, not because it didn't work, not because customers didn't want it, because it worked too well, because it gave people something the agricultural industry was working very hard to take away, the ability to feed themselves without asking permission, without buying inputs, without participating in a system designed to extract money from the simple act of growing food. The catalogs got thicker, the offerings got fancier, and the plants that required nothing vanished from the pages. In 1974, the USDA published a list. They called it the Federal Noxious Weed List. It was supposed to protect American agriculture from foreign invaders, from plants that would destroy crops and ruin farmland. Lamb's quarters didn't make that first list. It couldn't. It wasn't foreign. It had been growing in North America longer than anyone could remember, and even if you wanted to argue about its origins, it had been here so long that calling it an invader was like calling corn invasive. But state lists were different. State agriculture departments had more freedom, less oversight, and a closer relationship with the farming operations that funded their budgets. By the early 1980s, I started seeing lamb's quarters show up on state noxious weed lists. Not everywhere, not all at once, but enough. Ohio added it in 1983, Michigan in 1985, Pennsylvania in 1987. Each time the language was the same: aggressive, invasive, threatens agricultural productivity. My grandpa read about Pennsylvania's decision in the Farm Bureau newsletter. He was furious in that quiet way he got when anger went too deep for shouting. He said, "They're calling it aggressive because it grows without permission. They're calling it invasive because it doesn't stay where they tell it to stay. And they're saying it threatens agriculture because it threatens the kind of agriculture that needs you dependent." He was right. Once a plant gets labeled noxious or invasive, everything changes. It's not just a name, it's a legal designation. It means the Agriculture Department can mandate removal. It means you can be fined for growing it intentionally. It means extension agents can show up on your property and tell you to eradicate it. And it means that any conversation about the plant's value, its history, its role in feeding people gets shut down before it starts. You can't argue for a plant that's legally classified as a threat. You can't say, "But my grandma ate this during the Depression," when the state has declared it a danger to agricultural systems. You can't point to nutrition studies or historical use, or the fact that it's been growing here for generations. The label ends the conversation. That's what labels are for. I watched this happen with other plants, too. Purslane, another edible green with more omega-3 fatty acids than almost any plant you can grow. Noxious weed. Amaranth, a grain crop that fed entire civilizations. Invasive species. Dandelion, which has more vitamins than most of what's in the produce aisle. Aggressive spreader. Every single one of them had the same fatal characteristics. They grew without inputs. They reseeded themselves. They thrived in conditions that would kill commercial crops. And they couldn't be controlled. That last part is what mattered. Control. The noxious weed lists weren't about protecting agriculture. They were about protecting a specific kind of agriculture. The kind that requires bare soil, chemical inputs, purchase seeds, and total dominance over the landscape. Any plant that existed outside that system, that thrived in the margins, that fed people without corporate mediation, became a threat worth legislating against. My grandpa never pulled out his lamb's quarters. He ignored the recommendations. He figured he was too small for anyone to care about, too far out in the hills for inspectors to bother with. And he was right mostly, but the label did its work anyway. His neighbors stopped growing it. The younger generation learned that it was a weed, something to spray and kill. The knowledge got buried under the weight of official designation. They didn't need to come to every farm and pull it out by hand. They just needed to call it invasive. The word did the rest. There was a woman named Ruth Hendricks who lived about 8 miles from my grandpa's place. She had 40 acres that her husband left her when he died in 1979, and she ran that farm by herself until she was almost 90 years old. I met her at a church potluck in 1996, and she brought a dish that tasted like my childhood, lamb's quarters cooked with bacon and vinegar. I asked her where she got it. She said, "Same place I've been getting it for 50 years, north side of my barn." Ruth never stopped growing lamb's quarters, never even slowed down. When the extension agent came by in the mid-'80s and told her she needed to eradicate the noxious weeds on her property, she smiled at him real sweet and said, "Young man, that's not a weed, that's my food." He tried to explain the regulations. She told him she'd been eating it since before he was born, and she'd keep eating it until she was dead. He left. He never came back. Ruth was part of a network that nobody officially acknowledged, women mostly. Older folks who remembered the Depression, remembered the war years, remembered when food didn't come from stores with bright lights and wide aisles. They kept seeds, they traded cuttings, they told each other where the good patches were growing and how to harvest without killing the plant. They didn't advertise, they didn't sell at farmers' markets or put up signs. They just quietly kept growing food that the agricultural system had decided shouldn't exist. I knew another man, Carl Whitmore, who had a place up in the hollow. He grew lamb's quarters in the woods behind his house, under the canopy where his grandpa had grown it. In 1991, someone reported him to the county agriculture office. I never found out who. An inspector showed up with paperwork and a camera, documenting the invasive species on his property. Carl was 73 years old. He'd fought in Korea. He'd raised 6 kids on that land, and now he had some kid with a clipboard telling him that his food was illegal. The county sent him a letter. He had 90 days to remove the offending plants, or face fines of $500 per week. Carl called me because he knew I'd been asking around about lamb's quarters, trying to understand what had happened to it. He wanted to know if I thought he should fight it. I told him I didn't know. I told him I was sorry. He was quiet for a long time on the phone. Then he said, "My grandpa would have fought it, but my grandpa didn't have to worry about losing his land over a vegetable." Carl pulled it out, spent 3 days digging up plants that had been feeding his family for generations. He was crying when he did it. His daughter told me that later, said she'd never seen her father cry before, not even at funerals, but he cried pulling out those plants. Ruth died in 2003. Her farm got sold to a developer who turned it into 5-acre parcels for people from the city. I drove by there a few years back. The barn's gone. The house is gone. But on the north side of where that barn used to stand, there's still a patch of lamb's quarters growing in the shade of someone's new garage. Nobody who lives there knows what it is. Nobody knows Ruth kept it alive through decades of official pressure and cultural erasure, but it's still there, still growing, still waiting. That's what the holdouts did. They didn't preserve lamb's quarters in seed banks or botanical gardens. They just kept eating it. And the plant did what it always does. It survived. Let me tell you what lamb's quarters really threatened. It wasn't farmland. It wasn't crops. It wasn't the environment. What it threatened was a business model that requires you to be helpless. Think about what the industrial food system needs from you. It needs you to buy seeds every year. It needs you to buy fertilizer because the seeds won't grow without it. It needs you to buy pesticides because the plants are bred so weak they can't defend themselves. It needs you to have full sun and cleared land and tractors and irrigation systems. It needs you to fail if you don't have money. That's not a side effect, that's the design. Lamb's quarters required none of that. 0 fertilizer, 0 pesticides, 0 purchased seeds after the first year. It grew in shade, which meant you didn't need to clear land or compete for the sunny spots. It grew in poor soil. It grew in neglect. It grew despite you, not because of you. And it gave you protein, vitamins, minerals, everything your body needed from a green vegetable without asking you to participate in a system designed to extract wealth from the simple act of feeding yourself. That's what made it dangerous. Not to crops, to profits. My grandpa understood this better than I did for a long time. He'd say, "They don't want you to have anything that doesn't need 'em." I thought he was being paranoid. I thought he was just old and suspicious of change. Then I started looking at the pattern. Every plant that got labeled invasive or noxious had the same characteristics. Perennial or self-seeding, grew in marginal conditions, required no inputs, or provided food or medicine or materials that people could use without buying them. Dandelions, every part edible or medicinal. Taproot breaks up hardpan soil, grows anywhere. Noxious weed, purslane, more omega-3s than fish oil supplements, thrives in drought, reseeds itself forever. Invasive species amaranth, grain crop that doesn't need irrigation, protein content rivals meat. Leaves are edible too, prohibited in some counties. The pattern wasn't about ecology, it was about economics. These plants committed the unforgivable sin of making people independent. They grew food security that couldn't be monetized, couldn't be controlled, couldn't be turned into a quarterly earnings report. I talked to a seed company representative once at a farming conference. I asked him why they didn't carry lamb's quarters or any of the other traditional potherbs that used to be standard. He was honest in a way I didn't expect. He said, "There's no market for a vegetable people can grow for free forever. We're not in the business of selling you something once. We're in the business of selling you something every year." That's the truth they don't put in the marketing materials. The agricultural system isn't designed to feed you. It's designed to make you dependent on the people doing the feeding. Every innovation, every hybrid, every patented seed variety is built around the same goal. Make sure the farmer needs us next year. Make sure the gardener comes back. Make sure nobody can step outside the system and still eat. Lamb's quarters stepped outside the system. It had always been outside the system. It was food that existed before there was a system, and it kept existing after the system tried to erase it. That made it more than a weed. It made it a threat to the fundamental logic of industrial agriculture. You can't sell dependence to someone who's growing protein in the shade behind their barn without spending a dime. You can't extract profit from a plant that wants nothing from you except to be left alone. So you call it invasive, you put it on lists, you make it illegal, and you hope people forget it was ever food. Last summer I went to a farmer's market in Asheville. It's one of those upscale markets where people from the city come to buy heirloom tomatoes and artisan bread and feel connected to something real. I was walking past the vegetable stands when I saw it. Lamb's quarters, bunched up like fancy greens, tied with twine, sitting in a wooden crate next to the arugula and mizuna. There was a hand-lettered sign that said, "Wild foraged greens, $6 per bunch." $6. For a plant my grandpa considered too common to even think about. For a plant that grew itself in the shadows without asking. I stood there staring at it, not sure whether to laugh or feel sick. The young woman selling it couldn't have been more than 30. She had that look, earnest, passionate, probably came to farming from somewhere else. I asked her where she got the lamb's quarters. She said she foraged it from her property, that she was trying to introduce people to forgotten wild edibles that grew in the region. She talked about how it was more nutritious than spinach, how it thrived in shade, how it was perfectly adapted to the local ecosystem. I didn't tell her my grandpa grew it. I didn't tell her it used to be in seed catalogs. I didn't tell her that calling it wild foraged was technically true, but historically dishonest. That it was only wild now because we'd spent 50 years trying to erase it from cultivation. I just bought a bunch, $6 for what used to be free, but here's the thing, she was selling out. Every bunch gone by 10 in the morning, and the people buying it weren't old folks who remembered. They were young people, health-conscious people, people who'd never heard of lamb's quarters but recognized that it was something different from the grocery store greens they'd been eating their whole lives. They were paying premium prices for what their great-grandparents would have fed to the pigs. I started seeing it other places after that. A restaurant in Knoxville with a foraged green salad on the menu for $14. A permaculture farm in Tennessee selling lamb's quarters, seeds online, marketing them as shade-tolerant perennial protein. A food blogger writing about rewilding your diet with native plants, featuring lamb's quarters in a recipe that looked exactly like what my grandma used to make, except with more steps and fancier words. The revival is happening, but it's happening in a way that would make my grandpa shake his head. It's been turned into a boutique product, a premium item, something special and rare instead of common and dependable. The people growing it now are calling it permaculture and food forestry and regenerative agriculture. They're not wrong, but they're also not saying that this is just what people used to do, that this was normal, that the innovation isn't growing food in shade. The innovation was convincing everyone to stop. There's a permaculture teacher I know who gives workshops on shade gardening for food security. He teaches people how to grow lamb's quarters, chickweed, and other plants that thrive without sun. He charges $200 for a weekend course. I took it once just to see what he'd say. Everything he taught my grandpa knew. Everything he presented as cutting-edge technique was common knowledge 70 years ago. But the people in that workshop were amazed. They took notes. They asked questions. They had no idea their grandparents already knew all of this. That's where we are now, paying to relearn what we were taught to forget, calling it innovation when it's really just memory, treating lamb's quarters like a discovery when it's really a recovery. But at least it's coming back. At least people are eating it again. My grandpa died in 2004. The farm went to my uncle who doesn't live there. He rents the fields to a guy who grows soybeans, and the house sits empty most of the year. But that patch behind the barn, the one my grandpa's father planted and his father before him, it's still there. I went back last spring and walked the property. The lamb's quarters was growing thick and dark in the shade, just like it always had. Nobody planted it, nobody tends it, it just grows. That's the thing about plants like this. They don't need our permission to exist. They don't need our approval, or our cultivation, or our protection. They just wait. And when we're ready to remember, when we're ready to stop pretending that dependence is the same thing as progress, they're still there. This story isn't really about lamb's quarters. It's about a pattern that repeats across every corner of the food system. Every time something gives people independence, it gets labeled a threat. Every time something works without requiring corporate intervention, it gets erased from the catalogs and the curriculum and the cultural memory. Every time people figure out how to feed themselves without asking permission, the system finds a way to make that illegal or impractical, or just forgotten. They did it to lamb's quarters. They did it to amaranth and purslane and dandelion. They did it to heritage livestock breeds that could survive on pasture without grain. They did it to fruit trees that didn't need spraying. They did it to every crop and every practice and every piece of knowledge. that made people less dependent on the machinery of industrial agriculture, and they're still doing it right now. While you're watching this, there are plants growing in the margins, in the shadows, in the forgotten corners of the landscape that could feed people if people remembered they were food. There are seeds sitting in old barns and root cellars, waiting for someone to recognize what they are. There are elders who still know how to grow food without buying it, but nobody's asking them because we've been taught that real knowledge comes from universities and corporations, not from grandparents. The erasure isn't finished, but neither is the resistance. Every person who saves seeds is resisting. Every person who grows food in the shade is resisting. Every person who learns the old names and the old methods and teaches them to someone younger is resisting. And every person who hits subscribe on this channel, who watches these videos, who starts asking why we forgot, is part of that resistance. Because here's what they can't erase: the plants themselves. Lamb's quarters is still growing. It's in the woods. It's behind old barns. It's in vacant lots and forest edges and anywhere humans disturbed the soil and then walked away. It's waiting, not for permission, not for approval, just for someone to remember that it's food. My grandpa used to say that knowledge doesn't die. It just waits for people who are ready to use it. I didn't understand what he meant until I started looking for the plants and the practices and the ways of living that we were told to forget. They're all still here, quieter, hidden in the margins. But here, that patch behind the barn is still producing protein in the shade, still feeding anyone who knows what it is, still refusing to need anything from the system that tried to erase it, and it'll be there long after that system collapses under the weight of its own dependence. The knowledge waits, the plants wait, and if you hit subscribe, you'll be here when we remember the next one.